These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. My friends, it's nice to have you with me. This is the Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. It is the evening of the 20th of June, 2021. I'm here in Austin, Texas, and I hope that this finds you well. My essay this evening is entitled A Fortunate Shore, written by Russell Cordell Staker. At the time of his death, Camus had been at work on a novel which mortality forbade him to complete. What he managed to put on the page was published as he left it 35 years after his end. The novel is entitled The First Man. It tells the story of a young boy named Jacques Cormery as he grows up and verges upon manhood. Near the middle of the manuscript, Jacques is 9 years of age and attending primary school in Algiers. He is under the good care of a wise and kind teacher whose name is M. Bernard, a rare man, pure and good, and in full possession of a vast understanding and sensibility. M. Bernard recognizes intellectual potential in Jacques, even as he is sensitive to obstacles the boy is certain to face in life. The good teacher's broad awareness of the world and of the mind of a boy and the development of his own intelligence is supremely natural. Camus gives no insight for M. Bernard's tenderness, nor the source of its humanity. The teacher's decency is so profound and understated as to paint a broad picture of a man just as he is. He stands as a sentinel for Jacques and as a guide offering safe passage through the melee of the hard, cold years directly ahead of the boy. M. Bernard encourages Jacques to prepare for the baccalaureate examinations and be accepted into secondary school at the lycée, but that the undertaking will not be easy. He suggests Jacques go home and speak with his mother about it. The boy jumps at the suggestion and rushes home to relay the news. The boy's grandmother is picking lentils. Jacques divulges in a torrent of excitement this incredible opportunity. His grandmother listens and then reminds the boy that he is indeed an intelligent lad, but that he has no money and therefore cannot do this. From the height of a dream, he returns steeply into the palpable bitterness of life as it must be. He leaves the room dejected and the following day returns to the school, whereupon M. Bernard asks him what was said. Jacques replies he cannot proceed. Well, why not? Asks the teacher. Jacques responds, my grandmother says we're too poor, and I have to go to work next year. Camus gives no description of facial expressions, but I noted compassion on the face of M. Bernard as he looks upon the discouraged little boy before him. He asks softly, and your mother? Jacques deadpans, it's my grandmother who decides. M. Bernard, without missing a beat, looks at the boy and says, I know. He then says to Jacques, listen, you can't blame her. Life is hard for her. She's bound to be afraid. The teacher, seeing what is at stake, walks with Jacques back to his home so that he might speak privately with his grandmother, where he expands her frame of perspective. Quietly, she assents and grants the teacher her blessing to proceed. As M. Bernard departs the house, he pulls Jacques aside and says, your grandmother and mother are good women. Don't ever forget them. A pathway out of impoverished ignorance is offered and taken. In due course, Jacques passes the examination. Prior to matriculation into the lycée, M. Bernard comes to the house to say farewell. The scene is poignant. He tells the boy, you don't need me anymore. You'll have teachers who will know more, but you know where I am. As he leaves, he turns and waves at the boy one last time. Jacques experiences an immense anguish around his heart. He has been rescued from a bitterness his years are far too few to fully comprehend. Refinement comes in the form of fierce kindnesses we neither expect nor much deserve. Under the stars above and from the depths below, we persist along an uncharted line. So difficult it is to see in the dark. But out of abject anonymity, we persist in the hope of light from some fortunate shore. It's as if the light of that land, lit by someone who had made the same crossing long or even recently before we arrived there, rhetorically beckons, did you not know I was waiting for you? Only we can answer that question. But first, and just for a little while, we'll take a rest on that shore before we set out again to discover who we really are. RCS, 19 June 2021. And that is my essay for this evening. Albert Camus wrote this, Poor people's memory is less nourished than that of the rich. It has fewer landmarks in space because they seldom leave the place where they live, and fewer reference points in time throughout lives that are gray and featureless, the hour. It forgets sooner under the weight of fatigue. Remembrance of things past is just for the rich. For the poor, it only marks the faint traces on the path to death. I was thinking about Toni Morrison, and over the course of the last 2 years, really over the course of a year, I read a great deal. I read all of her novels and a great deal of her essays and speeches. And I've pulled together 3 quotes that are disparate in the sense that they may not have a direct throughput. But as I was reading what I just shared with Camus, and in thinking about recently reading the novel The First Man, which inspired the essay that I've written this evening, I pulled these 3, like I said, different quotes. It's a mélange of 3, or a verzameling, as they would say in Dutch, of thought that Toni Morrison triggered. So let me just read these, and we'll proceed from there. She said, "Writers are among the most sensitive, the most intellectually anarchic, most representative, most probing of artists. The ability of writers to imagine what is not the self, to familiarize the strange and mystify the familiar is the test of their power. The languages they use and the social and historical context in which these languages signify are indirect and direct revelations of that power and its limitations. As a writer reading, I came to realize the obvious. The subject of the dream is the dreamer. But it would be a pity if the criticism of that literature continued to shellac those texts, immobilizing their complexities and power and illuminations just below its tight reflecting surface. All of us readers and writers are bereft when criticism remains too polite or too fearful to notice a disrupting darkness before its eyes." Now, I share these, and in consideration of the quote that I just read previous to that from Albert Camus himself, in this way, in the sense that Toni Morrison's apt description of a writer, and in consideration of Albert Camus, who was one of the best, as was Toni Morrison, by the way, indeed obliterates memory and points clearly toward the honest, fortunate shore of things as they really are, which is why I titled the essay the way I did. We approach the shore, but do we see what is there before us, just as Camus sees and advises we look? It can be hard to look. What we see isn't usually pretty, but the truth is there. But seeing is just the beginning. You have to study and learn so that you can make up your own mind about history and everything else, but you don't make up an empty mind. Stock your mind. I take that from another book written by the late, great Frank McCourt, who wrote the astounding memoir, Angela's Ashes. And I'm just going to read just a snippet from that book. "Mr. O'Halloran can't lie. He's the headmaster. All these years we were told the Irish were always noble, and they made brave speeches before the English hanged them. Now Hoppy O'Halloran is saying the Irish did bad things. Next thing, he'll be saying the English did good things. He says, you have to study and learn so that you can make up your own mind about history and everything else, but you can't make up an empty mind. Stock your mind. Stock your mind. It is your house of treasure, and no one in the world can interfere with it. If you won the Irish sweepstakes and bought a house that needed furniture, would you fill it with bits and pieces of rubbish? Your mind is your house, and if you fill it with rubbish from the cinemas, it will rot in your head. You might be poor, your shoes might be broken, but your mind is a palace." From Frank McCourt, I jumped to the writer Joanne Harris, who wrote the novel Chocolat. It was published in 1999, and then the following year was made into a charming film in 2000 starring Juliette Binoche and Judi Dench, Alfred Molina, and Johnny Depp. And it was directed by Lasse Hallström. And near the end of the film, when the young priest, he's a hesitant priest, youthful, not very experienced, but sincere in his way, he stands before his parish which previously the Comte de Renaud, played by Alfred Molina, has been holding hostage until this particular moment of the Comte's personal disgrace. I'm not going to get into the detail. It has to do with Chocolat. And if you have a chance, please read the novel. It's wonderful. The movie is just charming. But this young priest, he's generous and kind in his Easter sermon. And he stands before this parish and offers insight into the grandeur of our shared commonness. And it was something that pulled me in when I saw the film. And in his words is a redemption, something that even for the mortified Comte existed, and the Comte recognized it and felt this redemptive spirit as he listened to this young priest offer an eternal perspective. And it's a message for us all. The priest, he says, and I'm going to just paraphrase this here, he says, "I don't want to talk about his, or of his, the Lord's, divinity. I'd rather talk of his humanity, his kindness, his tolerance." That kindness and that tolerance that struck me with such force, and it still does as I reflect on that film and I come back to it. It's the crossroads for me. That for a long time in my life, I felt that pursuing this idea of divinity was the most important aspect. And underneath that, I already knew that really wasn't the point for me. And I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but what I've come to know as I've gotten older is that the crossroads really is at the level of our humanity. And I believe that's where God, or the higher force, or the power, whatever it is that we want to call that thing, that's where that exists. And it goes back to where I was considering as I wrote the essay, and I titled this A Fortunate Shore. I believe it's the shore that we're reaching for. Camus wrote another very powerful part of this context that I was taking in, that was just kind of going over in my mind as I was writing my essay and just kind of doing some thinking. And this particular little sentence or so comes from the novel The First Man, which was his final work, which he, as I'd mentioned, did not finish. He was killed in a horrible car accident in 1960 in the French countryside. At the height of his power, he was only 46 years old. He'd been awarded the Nobel laureate 3 years prior. He was writing at a level that was just profound, and I've read all of his novels, and I'm in the process of reading his essays. And at the time when he was writing this book, there is such a human depth in the story. It was all there, and it's masterful in its unfinished form, which was published in, I think, 1995 by his family, untouched. It was actually as he left it. And it's just wonderful. I can't imagine what the finished novel would have been had he been graced to live long enough to finish that. But he writes this in that novel. He says, and he's speaking of Jacques Cormery, the character, the boy that I'd mentioned in the essay. He says, "An untamed and hungry intellect, a ravenous appetite for life, a secret part of his being, like those measureless waters under the earth from which the depths of rocky labyrinths have never seen the light of day, and yet dimly reflect a light that comes from who knows where. This blind stirring in him which had never ceased, which he still felt now, a dark fire buried in him, stirring, matched to this immense country around him." In considering The Fortunate Shore, I can't help but imagine the immense country just beyond its line in the sand. So imagine, if you will, like a red lighthouse just on the edge of a sandy beach, a soft-looking beach, nothing craggy. It's inviting. It's out in the open. There's the ebb and flow of water. Imagine the scent of the smell in the air, that sea air that can be very peaceful. The sound. It's kind of a gray day. The sand is soft. It's brown. It's damp. It looks like it's just rained. And this lighthouse is sitting up on a little soft hill, a green little knoll, if you will. And it's beautifully painted. And it offers this kind light. And even in the day, I'm imagining this in the day. So just imagine this with me for a moment. There's this kindness in the light. And it's the shore that we're standing on at the very moment that we're looking at it. And then out over the water, as we look out, is the sense of a traverse, of a place that maybe we have crossed. Maybe we haven't, but you can imagine, if you're standing on a shore, that thought of being out on a ship or a boat or a small little skiff somewhere. And maybe the idea of this storm as it's building, what that would be like to be on the water and to find that lighthouse. and to realize that there is this safe harbor there. This idea, this little picture that I've just painted, this fortunate shore, is to suggest, or it isn't to suggest, this is to imply I speak, or possibly even Camus is speaking of in metaphor for paradise. But that's not remotely what I'm considering. The shore is here. The shore lighted under some red lighthouse on this soft green hill under these darkening skies is this world right now. We're here. We're standing on that shore. But as I was writing the essay, I was thinking about it. Even as we stand on it, we stand apart from it. We look out toward that shore because we have this constant struggle in our minds about what's out there beyond this shore. And at the same time, we're trying to figure out what this shore is really all about, rather than accepting it just as it is right now. And I was thinking about some rhetorical questions. Have we fully entered into this shore as we might, or as we possibly should? Are we standing there the way we would like to? Is it something that we understand, or if not understand, that we feel a part of? How much of its landscape do we actually behold? And once here, or once there, if we're looking at it from the perspective of looking over at a shore, pretending as if we're out to sea, so to speak, what do we notice to keep in our memory? What will we retain? Because I go back to this idea that we're only just going to remember how it feels. That's actually a line from one of my favorite songs by Rob Thomas, Little Wonders. He mentions that. And I've used that phrase in my head many, many times, that we're only just going to remember how it feels after all. So in carrying this over, now again, this is just kind of some wash, if you will, like seawater, that brackish water, the warmth, maybe it's cold. But this description that I have, imagine that we're just kind of in that tide a little bit. So now we're a part of the water, we're approaching that shore. These were all things that were bubbling up in my mind as I was writing and as I was considering this, as I was reading Camus. As I was reading Toni Morrison, I think subconsciously I had some of these ideas. And it's interesting, I'll find myself reading something, and then all of a sudden this idea kind of takes a fine point of, if not understanding, just a better point of consideration. So I'm going to carry this forward just a little bit. This is a continuation of some of what Camus writes in his unfinished manuscript, The First Man. He says, and again, this is tied around Jacques Cormery, and he who wanted to escape the country and crowd without name, but in whom something had gone on craving darkness and anonymity, he too was a member of the tribe marching blindly into the night, listening to the gusts of music coming from the square, also seeing with a sweetness and a sorrow that wrung his heart the deathly look on his mother's face, wandering in the night of the years in the land of oblivion where each one is the first man or woman. I put woman in there. Where he had to bring himself up without a father, having never known those moments when a father could call his son after waiting for him to reach the age of listening to tell him the family secret, or a sorrow of long ago with the experience of his life. He, Jacques, had to learn by himself to grow alone in fortitude and strength, find his own morality and truth, and at last be born as a man, and then to be born in a harder childbirth, which consists of being born in relation to others, who learn to live without roots or faith, and today all of them are threatened with eternal anonymity. The illegible slabs of the cemetery that the night has now covered over, they had to learn how to live in relation to others, to the immense host of the conquerors, now dispossessed, who had preceded them on this land, and in whom they now had to recognize the brotherhood of race and destiny. And yet now he knew from the bottom of his heart that what represented him had never been anything to him. He had tried to escape from anonymity, from a life that was poor, ignorant, and mulish. He could not live that life of blind patience without words, with no thought beyond the present. He had traveled far and wide and built, created, and loved people and abandoned them. His days had been full to overflowing, yet now he knew from the bottom of his heart, and he thought of the warm and green-encrusted gravestones he had just left, acknowledging with a strange sort of pleasure that death would return him to his true homeland, and with its immense oblivion would obliterate the memory of that alien and ordinary man who had grown up and built in poverty without help and deliverance on a fortunate shore in the light of the first mornings of the world, and then alone without memories and without faith he had entered the world of the men of his time and its dreadful and exalted history. That was Albert Camus. Absolutely extraordinary. I read that not to say that even myself in reading it grasps all of it in one take. I've read that many times through. It's something to read and almost let it come over you as if you're in deep water, because it is. But it's something that it's almost as if you don't listen to it, but you let yourself feel it. The truth is there and you recognize it. What came to me, and as I was going through this thought process, is that, and again, this is an obvious thought. We all understand this. You don't have to read Camus to understand it. Camus gets into the space that we're already in, but he does it with the power of language, is that life is hard. We are here now to taste our own blood. It's a bitter taste, and it's in our mouths all the time, whether we recognize it or not. It's on our lips. We take the blood in our mouth, and this is metaphorical, but it could also be very, very literal in the sense of the beatings that we take. And these aren't like physical, although they certainly could be, but the beatings that come as a result of what goes on in this mortal sojourn that we're in. It's heavy. It's unknown. It's dark. And I think one of the things at times that can be very disconcerting is that we want to reach for an easy answer. We want to reach for this buttoned up, very clean explanation for what it's about, why we're here, and then where we're going. But I think it takes greater courage to look at it in the way that Camus is suggesting. And he's not doing it in a way to point the finger, but he uses it through, and this is the power of literature here, the power of fiction, through this story that he tells of Jacques Cormery. And in the breadth of his writing, which I've had the great honor to be reading very extensively over just the course of these last many months, is that he has a very open sense about looking at the things that are hard to look at, that are right in front of us. And he does it in a way that suggests that if we look just a little bit harder, maybe we open ourselves up to the idea that even if we don't have a full grasp of what this is, because none of us really do, it's worth the effort to look at it as honestly as we can. Further on, Camus writes of a very specific example, and I'm touching on this idea that I was thinking of swallowing the blood. Swallowing our own blood. And these are my words. Camus didn't write this, but this is kind of what I was thinking about. But you're going to see where I drew this from. Jacques Cormery's grandmother takes her grandson Jacques to a very heavy-handed parish priest for preparation of his first communion and the requisite catechism. The mythology and culture and requirement of religion, the stubbornness of the grandmother and her programming insist that Jacques accelerate toward this religious rite of passage even as he is burdened with the opportunity that M. Bernard offered him for his school in learning. And this life hardship pressure that he feels as there's this confluence of things that are starting to take shape even in his young years. We all go through different things like this. There are different forces and pressures in our lives, and he touches on that, and it was very relatable. So the grandmother takes Jacques. She forces the priest's hands to have this communion moved up to accelerate the timing because of everything else that Jacques is taking part of. And poor little Jacques is running full. There's no playroom for him. The first priest is kindly, but the enforcer priest, just under this kind priest, is this tall, eagle-beaked, very stern man who feels slighted at a facial expression that Jacques makes, which was harmless and not intended for him, but this priest took it as that, nevertheless. And he believes that the grimace was aimed at him and takes it upon himself to enforce respect for this, for his sacred character of office, if you will. And so he therefore calls Jacques up before the whole assembly of children. And in the quotation here from the story, Camus writes, there, with his long, bony hand, without further explanation, he hit him, Jacques, with all his strength. Jacques almost fell under the force of the blow. The priest says, now go back to your place. The child stared at him without a tear. And for all his life, it would be kindness and love that made him cry, never pain or persecution, which on the contrary only reinforced his spirit and his resolution and returned to his bench. The left side of his face was smarting. The taste of blood was in his mouth. With the tip of his tongue, he discovered the inside of his cheek was cut by the blow and was bleeding. He swallowed his blood. And sometimes, maybe all too often, so must we swallow our blood. Whether that's literal or metaphor, or both, I think that exists. We are here now, and one day we will not be here again. But the fierce kindnesses we receive, and particularly those we render to those who may not be able to offer any for themselves, will possibly be what we cherish the most before the experience of abiding this terrible and fortunate mortal shore passes. So I'm going to leave you this evening with the final concluding words tonight from Albert Camus. He writes, "He went out, and Jacques was left alone, lost among the women, and he dashed to the window and looked out at his teacher. He waved at him one last time, and who was leaving him alone henceforth? And instead of the joy of success, a child's immense anguish around his heart, as if he knew in advance that this success had just uprooted him from the warm, innocent world of the poor, a world closed in on itself like an island in the society where poverty took the place of family and community, to be hurtled into a strange world, one no longer his, where he could not believe the teachers were more learned than the one whose heart was all-knowing, and from now on he would have to learn to understand, and without help, and become a man without the aid of the one man who had rescued him. He would have to grow up and bring himself up alone, and it would be at the highest cost. Just marvelous. Fan, RCS." I do want to add a postscript. So just today, which happens to be Father's Day, I watched this morning with my boys for probably the third or fourth time, Disney's Pixar movie Soul. And there was one particular scene that really, really got me. And it's this just brief instant as the character played by Jamie Foxx, his name is Joe Gardner. He's a jazz musician, jazz teacher. And as he's reflecting on various things about the experience of his life, he remembers a moment when he's sitting in a diner on a very snowy evening, and you see this image of Joe Gardner alone on this very delightful diner. It's well lit. And he's having a taste of pecan pie on this very snowy night. And it really, really hit me hard, because it goes back to what I think I'm suggesting here on that fortunate shore. At the very end of the film, the question is asked of Joe Gardner, this character played by Jamie Foxx, "What are you going to do with your life?" And he says, "I don't know, but I do know I'm going to live every minute of it," as he steps from the threshold and out the door into a brand new day. It's an honor to be able to just share these few thoughts with you. I hope some of this made some kind of inspired sense. And to all of you dads out there, happy Dad's Day. And Dad, wherever you're at in the stars, I love you. I'll be back with another podcast next month. Hang tight. And remember, even when it's rough, even when the storm's a little heavy, the shore we're standing on right now, it's a pretty fortunate one. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.